This video contains themes of murder and sexual assault, which may be distressing for some viewers. The youngest of four daughters of Paul and Linda Bowman, Sally Ann Bowman was born on September the 11th, 1987 in Carshalton, South London. Her parents later divorced, but Sally Ann enjoyed a close relationship with her family. Sally Ann was extremely popular, carefree and generous. She was also said to be quite mature for her age and worked hard to support herself, so she made the decision to move out of the family home as soon as she was old enough, living in rented accommodation. Despite having moved out, Sally Ann made sure to remain in contact with her family regularly. Sally Ann was particularly passionate about singing and dancing, and she was accepted into the Brit School, a performing and creative arts school in Selhurst, Croydon, whose other notable alumni include Amy Winehouse, Emily Head, and Freya Ridings. Outside of her studies, she also modelled and took on modelling jobs where possible. The 6-foot blonde had hoped to appear on the front cover of Vogue, and had been compared to supermodel Kate Moss. After leaving school in 2004, Sally Ann worked part-time as a hairdresser and model. In January 2005, she joined Pulse Model Management, a local modelling agency. She became the face of Swatch watches and participated in the Swatch Alternative Fashion Weekend in April 2005. On September the 24th, 2005, just under 2 weeks after her 18th birthday, Sally Ann was staying at her mother's house. Her sister, Nicole, phoned the house and asked Sally Ann if she wanted to go out in the evening to celebrate the birthday of Nicole's best friend. Sally Ann got ready that evening and left her mother's house. Linda told Sally Ann that she loved her. Sally Ann returned the comment and left the house. Sally Ann met Nicole and they went to one of their favourite pubs in the town centre. They were captured on CCTV laughing, dancing and enjoying their night out. As the night began to wind down in the small hours of September the 25th, Sally Ann and Nicole walked out into the town centre. Sally Ann began speaking to her ex-boyfriend, Lewis Sproston, via phone. Their relationship had ended a few weeks earlier, and she wanted to see him. Sally Ann ordered a taxi from her sister's house back into Croydon, where Sproston met her in his car. He picked her up at around 2:20 a.m. and drove her to Blenheim Crescent, where she was renting a room. Emotions were still very raw after the breakup, and it was not long before the two began arguing, accusing one another of infidelity. The argument continued until around 4:15 a.m., after which Sally Ann left the car and Sproston drove away. A witness said they were woken by a, quote, garbled noise, ending in a scream. The witness then got out of bed and looked out of their window, but couldn't see anything. They returned to the window 5 minutes later, keeping their lights off. They saw a man walking down the street, but with no other noise and no one else around, they went back to bed. At around 6:30 a.m. on the morning of September the 25th, a neighbour went outside and saw what they thought to be the legs of a mannequin protruding from behind a skip. They went over to investigate and found the mutilated body of a young woman, and knew immediately that she was dead. The woman was Sally Ann Bowman. She was found dead exactly 2 weeks after her 18th birthday. Police quickly arrived at the scene and sealed off the area. After the murder squad was called in, an investigation was almost immediately underway. Linda Bowman heard knocking on her front door and initially assumed that Sally Ann was at the door. As Linda opened the door, she was met with 3 police officers who asked her if she was Linda Bowman and if she knew Sally Ann Bowman. Linda replied that she was Linda Bowman and that Sally Ann was her daughter. The officer then had the unenviable job of informing Linda Bowman that her youngest daughter had been found stabbed to death. Linda would later comment, quote, I just remember screaming, absolutely screaming. I couldn't believe it. My whole world fell apart. Police then had to break the news to Sally Ann's sister Michelle. Michelle said, quote, I remember something leaving me that day, and it's never, ever come back. Although the investigation had begun only a few hours earlier, Michelle and Linda had the traumatic task of formally identifying Sally Ann's body. Michelle said, quote, "I remember going into the room, and for a split second I thought it wasn't her, because her hair was dark, and I just moved forward and saw her little button nose and her freckles, and that was it." Linda was hysterical and inconsolable upon seeing her youngest daughter's body. Michelle was crying, quote, "Please wake her up, Mum. Please wake her up." Within a couple of days of Sally Ann's body being found, her family made the incredibly difficult decision to learn more from the police. Detective Chief Superintendent Stuart Cundy visited the family home to share the findings so far. Exactly what happened in the minutes after Sally Ann left Louis Sproston's car remains unclear, but police believe that Sally Ann was standing alone on the driveway, less than 10 metres from her front door, when she was caught suddenly in a violent, frenzied attack, during which she was stabbed at least 7 times. 3 of the stab wounds were so strong that they passed through her body. There was also evidence that she had been raped after death, and that she had been bitten, leaving DNA evidence. Because he was the last person to have seen Sally Ann alive, her ex-boyfriend Louis Sproston became a possible suspect. He and Sally Ann had been arguing up until a few minutes before her death, so it wasn't unreasonable for police to assume that he was involved. Officers launched the search for Sproston, and he was soon found with his brother and a friend. He identified himself and was subsequently arrested and taken in for questioning. Over 4 days, the murder squad questioned Sproston and took his DNA. He maintained that he knew nothing about Sally Ann's murder until the police arrived at his home. His DNA was sent to a laboratory to confirm if it matched the DNA found on Sally Ann's body. This appeared to be a straightforward case. An argument between estranged exes had ended in tragedy. However, when the police received a call from the Forensic Science Service, it became clear that the case was more complex than previously thought. The DNA was a match, but not to Louis Sproston. It matched a disturbing sexual assault cold case from 4 years earlier, only a mile and a half from where Sally Ann had been brutally murdered. Police were now racing against time. They had to find a killer whose crimes were escalating and who could strike again. Back in 2001, a woman was making a call in a telephone box near the car park of a Tesco store when a man approached her. He proceeded to expose himself and masturbate in front of her before leaving his DNA on the floor in the phone box. He then casually walked away across the car park, leaving his terrified victim deeply shaken. The police had a DNA profile of the attacker, but the case went cold. Officers now working on Sally Ann's case were faced with a shocking question. If this man had attacked a woman in 2001 and then murdered a young woman 4 years later, what had he done in the intervening years, and how many more victims could he have claimed? Police soon learnt that less than an hour before Sally Ann Bowman was murdered, another woman had been attacked in nearby Sanderstead Road. The woman in question had been standing alone in the street, making a phone call, when a man approached her from behind. He apologised before hitting her over the head. Officers were convinced that if this man had not been scared away by an oncoming taxi, the attack would have escalated. However, before running away, the man seized the victim's mobile phone. The phone was still connected, and the person on the other end of the line heard everything. The victim's screams did not get quieter, meaning the assailant was hiding nearby and watching. Fortunately, the taxi driver put the woman into the car and drove her to hospital. The victim was able to give a detailed description of her attacker, from which the police produced this e-fit. Police believed this was the same man responsible for the murder of Sally Ann Bowman. Although the e-fit was widely circulated and the police received many calls from the public, no one was able to provide a name for this man. After the murder squad regrouped and focused on the DNA found on Sally Ann's body, they knew this DNA profile held the key to identifying the man responsible for this case and the earlier crimes. Detectives believed that the killer was a local man and knew the area well. Based on this theory, police decided to conduct a DNA screening of the area. With 6,000 addresses to visit, the task was enormous, and every single one would need to disclose how many men lived there or were staying there on the night of Sally Ann Bowman's death. 4,000 men were living in South Croydon who fit the description. Police knew the chances of the killer coming forward and offering a DNA sample were next to none, but they hoped that a male relative, such as a father or brother, would come forward and provide that crucial link. Despite the initial promise of the DNA testing centre, the investigation began to slow down after 6 months, and police were running out of options. As the investigation started to slow down, in March 2006, officers changed strategy and returned to the e-fit of the man who had attacked a woman less than an hour before Sally Ann Bowman was brutally murdered. Police were certain that this man was responsible for the murder of Sally Ann. They released another e-fit of the man who had attacked the woman in the phone box, the man with the same DNA as Sally Ann's killer. The woman in the phone box did not complete an e-fit in the original investigation, so police were hopeful that she would be able to contribute to the investigation. Fortunately, police did not have to wait long for the break they needed. 20 miles away in Crawley, on June 15, 2006, during the World Cup final between England and Trinidad and Tobago, a man was arrested following a fight with another man. After the aggressor shoved the other man to the ground, a nearby policeman intervened and the aggressor was arrested. He was identified as 35-year-old Mark Dixie, a pub chef who worked at Ye Olde Six Bells in Hawley, Surrey. Dixie's demeanour during the interview was described as, quote, very tearful and, quote, incredibly emotional, despite the relatively minor nature of the offence. As is customary, his fingerprint and DNA were taken, and he was released on bail. 12 days after Dixie's release, the murder squad finally got the news for which they had been waiting for 9 months. The DNA found on Sally Ann's body was a match for Mark Dixie. Police needed to stop Dixie before he could harm another woman. Worryingly, however, he had fled the country. Dixie had fled to Amsterdam to escape the manhunt. After 3 months, he had an argument with his landlord and returned to the United Kingdom, after which he returned to his job at Ye Olde Six Bells. Following his arrest in June 2006, he told police that his workplace was also where he was staying. Knowing how dangerous Dixie was, and that his workplace gave him access to knives, officers needed to get him out of the kitchen. As officers scouted the premises in search of a side entrance, Dixie came outside, allowing the officers to apprehend him immediately. The arresting officer described how he put his hand across Dixie's chest to stop him from running away, and said he could feel his heartbeat. Dixie's heartbeat did not change, and he remained surprisingly calm despite the nature of the offence for which he was being arrested. The following day, Dixie was charged with the murder of Sally Ann Bowman. He remained silent as the charge sheet was read out. That night, DC Graham Bannatyne, the family liaison officer, phoned Linda Bowman at around 9 p.m. to ask if he could visit the family to break the news that the man who had viciously taken Sally Ann Bowman's life was in custody. But who is Mark Dixie? Mark Philip Dixie was born on September 24, 1970, in Streatham, London, and had a troubled upbringing. His parents separated when he was 18 months old, and his mother had 2 sons with her new husband. The young Dixie assumed the name Mark James MacDonald, taking his stepfather's surname. During his childhood, Dixie spent time in a children's home. After leaving school, he trained for 4 years as a chef. Dixie had a lengthy criminal history starting in 1986, when he was 15 or 16. In 1986, he held a woman at knife point, for which he was sentenced to 6 weeks in prison. In 1987, he was convicted of robbery. In 1988, he was in prison for 2 years for indecent assault and assault occasioning actual bodily harm. In 1989, he was convicted of indecent exposure and forced to complete 80 hours of community service. In 1990, he was convicted of assaulting a police officer. As detectives learned, Dixie's criminal activity was not confined to the United Kingdom. In 1993, Dixie moved to Australia and soon found himself in trouble with the law. After overstaying his visa, the crimes began again. In 1998, a 19-year-old Thai student was alone in her house in Perth when she heard noises in her kitchen. She went to investigate and encountered Mark Dixie, wearing a stocking pulled over his head. He was also armed with a knife. The woman was stabbed 27 times and lost consciousness. Dixie sexually assaulted her before stealing several items from her house and fleeing. Thankfully, the woman survived this terrifying ordeal. Unfortunately, this was not Dixie's final crime in Australia. On New Year's Day in 1999, Dixie assaulted a woman running in Bunbury, around 105 miles south of Perth. Dixie spotted the woman from his car and drove further on before stripping naked and hiding in a bush. He jumped out in front of the woman and asked her to perform a sex act. 3 days later, he was fined $750 for this incident. In April 1999, he was deported from Australia. After Dixie was formally charged with Sally Ann's murder, the work for detectives was only just beginning. Over the next 18 months, detectives painstakingly pieced together Dixie's movements to ascertain why he had killed Sally Ann. They spoke to friends and associates of Dixie to learn more about him. It transpired that Dixie had been out with friends on September the 24th, 2005, to celebrate his 35th birthday, in a pub only a few hundred yards from where Sally Ann lived. His birthday was a very important day for him, and he liked to go the full 9 yards. That night, however, Dixie's girlfriend did not join him in the pub. While he was out, he called her, and when he returned a few minutes later, his friend said his demeanour had changed completely, having become withdrawn, sullen, and angry. Dixie spent the remainder of the evening drinking excessively and taking cocaine. After the pub closed, he and 2 female friends left for Avondale Road, where he was due to spend the night. Avondale Road is a short walk from Blenheim Crescent. After his 2 female friends went to bed in the small hours, Dixie did not go to bed. Police theorised that he left the property between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m. They also believed that he armed himself with a knife with the intention of finding a woman and attacking her. Investigators firmly believed he was the same man who had attacked the woman on Sanderstead Road and was frustrated when he was unable to fulfil his fantasy. When Dixie went to Blenheim Crescent, it appeared that Sally Ann was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She and Dixie were total strangers to one another. It appeared that after the murder, Dixie did not leave Blenheim Crescent immediately, but instead hid to see if any neighbours would come out to investigate. No neighbours appeared, and no lights in any of the houses came on. What he did not know, however, was that a neighbour had heard Sally Ann scream and was looking out of her bedroom window while keeping her bedroom light off. Police believed that the man seen walking down the street was Mark Dixie. Assuming that nobody was awake or watching, he returned to Sally Ann's body and sexually assaulted her before or after her death. He returned to the property he was sharing with his 2 female friends and then bedded down on the sofa. He woke up the next morning and acted as if nothing had happened. While Dixie was in custody, police contacted Australian police and asked them to check if his DNA matched any of the crimes they had on record. There was a match with the 1998 assault on the Thai student in Perth. On February the 5th, 2008, Mark Dixie appeared at the Old Bailey in London, where his cold, detached demeanour left the courtroom stunned. During the trial, the Thai woman from Perth testified that Dixie had stabbed and raped her in 1998. Dixie has yet to be formally charged with this offence, though the DNA sample from her underwear has been matched to him. Dixie's defence was extraordinary. He admitted raping Sally Ann and leaving his DNA on her body. He added that he encountered whom he thought to be a drunk woman lying unconscious, so he seized the opportunity to sexually assault her. However, he denied responsibility for Sally Ann's murder. Of course, Dixie's defence did not sway the jury, and on February the 22nd, 2008, Dixie was sentenced to a mandatory life sentence with a minimum term of 34 years. This is one of the longest sentences imposed for a single murder in British criminal history. This means that he will be at least 71 or 72 years old before he can be considered for parole. Dixie began his prison term at HMP Belmarsh, a Category A prison in Thamesmead, London. He was transferred to HMP Longlartin, near South Littleton, Worcestershire, after fellow inmates in Belmarsh threatened to attack him. In 2014, it was reported that Dixie had been moved again, this time to HMP Frankland in Brasside, County Durham, for his own protection. This prison is notable for having housed Peter Sutcliffe, better known as the Yorkshire Ripper, from August 2016 until his death in November 2020. Due to the importance of DNA solving her daughter's case, Linda Bowman has become a vocal advocate for a compulsory DNA database. She believes that if Dixie's DNA had not been found, Lewis Sproston may have been wrongly convicted of Sally Ann's murder. Stuart Cundy, who led the investigation into Sally Ann Bowman's murder, agrees with this, stating, quote, "It is my opinion that a national database register, with all its appropriate safeguards, could have identified Sally Ann's murderer within 24 hours. Instead, it took nearly 9 months before Mark Dixie was identified, and 2.5 years for justice to be done." Although there were calls for a DNA database following Sally Ann's murder, these were rejected by ministers and politicians on the grounds that it would be, quote, "impractical and could have negative implications for civil liberties." In January 2015, more than 9 years after Sally Ann Bowman's murder and nearly 7 years into his sentence, Mark Dixie finally confessed to the murder. To date, however, he has never provided an explanation for his actions. In 2017, Dixie was charged with more offences, and it was revealed that a man had been wrongly convicted of some of his sickening crimes. In 2003, a Dutchman named Romano van der Dussen was convicted of raping 3 women in the Costa del Sol region of Spain. He served 12 years in a Spanish prison and was constantly attacked by inmates. Dixie was a free man during this time. In 2015, a Dutch newspaper reported that Dixie had confessed to one of these sexual assaults. Van der Dussen was acquitted of these crimes in 2016 and was present at Suffolk Crown Court on November 24, 2017, when Dixie was handed 2 additional life sentences for attacks on 2 women in Croydon. Dixie admitted raping a woman in a deserted car park in 1987, leaving her bound and gagged as he set her car ablaze. He ran away with her credit card details, and later that night he called her landline number to taunt and frighten her. He called again the following evening. Traumatized by this ordeal, the woman relocated to the countryside to be as isolated as possible. Dixie also confessed to hitting a woman over the head with a chef's iron before dragging her to an isolated spot on Selsdon Road in 2002, where he indecently assaulted her. The woman had been leaving messages on her boyfriend's phone on her way home, but in the last message, she could be heard screaming and dropping the phone. Dixie only left when a concerned neighbour scared him off. Having stolen the victim's mobile phone, he called her boyfriend to brag about what he had done to the woman. The victim was left with multiple skull fractures. Dixie's only comment on this attack was, quote, "It could have been worse." After Dixie was convicted of these offences in November 2017, DCI Chris Lapere, part of the team responsible for investigating Sally Ann Bowman's murder, said, quote, "I hope today's sentence will bring a small measure of closure to these 2 women. With the advancement in forensic technology, we were able to link Dixie to these offences and bring him to justice." Although nothing can bring back Sally Ann Bowman, the Bowman family were deeply grateful for the police's efforts in uncovering what had happened to their beloved daughter and sister. Special praise went to the family liaison officer, Graham Bannatyne, who provided invaluable support during the investigation. The damage done by Mark Dixie is immeasurable and incalculable. Lives have been destroyed, generations have been wiped out, women have lived in fear, and an innocent man was wrongly convicted. Michelle Bowman, sister of Sally Ann Bowman, said the following, quote, You get that split second in the morning when you wake up and your life is perfect. Everything is how you want it to be, and then bang, it's there, and it hits you. Worrying to close your eyes, not knowing what you're going to see, not knowing if you're going to see that Sally that you remember, or that Sally that you see from the pictures. And that fear goes through me every night when I go to sleep. The nightmares don't ever stop. There's not anything in this world that will ever make it better, because she will never come back. If any good can come from this, it's that Dixie will likely spend the rest of his life in prison, meaning he can never harm another woman again.